Piet Vendrick, Minister Counselor of the American Embassy in The Hague, to Andrew Peavy, Public Affairs Officer of the American Embassy, and the new Consul General in Amsterdam, Andrew Campbell. We consider ourselves very lucky that you take such a keen interest in our program. My name is Anne Wertheim, and I'm the director of the John Adams Institute. For many years, we have felt it to be our mission to present American culture to a broad and interested Dutch and expatriate audience. So it is with great pleasure that we organize 10 to 11 lectures per year with American authors, artists, and scientists, and other celebrated people from across the Atlantic. If you haven't done so yet to look at our brochures, please do so and sign up as a donor or a contributor, because we need your contributions in order to continue the program. Professor Diamond's book, Guns, Germs and Steel, was first brought to my attention by Karel Pauwe, member of the board of TNT Post Group, who in turn was tipped off by the Global Institute of McKinsey & Company. And this is why we have asked Mr. Pauwe to close the evening, which will end at around 9:30. I would like to thank Mr. Diamond, Mr. Diamond's Dutch publisher, the Spectrum and book importers Nielsen and Lam and Van Ditmar for helping to make this event possible. I will now hand the floor to Maarten van Rossem, who teaches the cultural history of the 20th century at the University of Utrecht. After Mr. van Rossem's introduction and after Mr. Diamond's talk, the evening will continue without intermission with a conversation between Mr. Diamond and Mr. van Rossem. The audience is free to come to the microphones and to join in with questions. The lecture tonight will be cybercast by Expanded and is available starting tomorrow at 12 noon on the John Adams Institute website. Professor Diamond has pre-signed books because he very much wishes to return to his hotel as soon as possible after the event is over. However, he has kindly agreed to do book signing afterwards, but we urge you to do it fast and keep the dedications limited. One word before Maarten van Rossem begins. Our next lecture will be held on 22 November with a special guest, the well-known Polish journalist Richard Kapuscinski. And I would like to remind everyone with a cell phone, please switch them off. Thank you and enjoy your program. And Maarten van Rossem, please come to the podium.
When he isn't writing great books, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Diamond is a professor of physiology at the Medical School of the University of California, Los Angeles. He has been a faculty member there since 1966, and his research interests are regulation of nutrient transport and integrative and evolutionary physiology, both subjects that I do not know anything about. And the interesting question, of course, is why is it that somebody who is working on nutrient transport, as far as I've read in the intestines of snakes and kindred animals, how somebody came to write a book like Guns, Germs and Steel? Well, Professor Diamond has written that he has been an avid bird watcher since the age of 7, where you can see that anybody with scientific interest should have some kind of strange outside interests, because it always turns out that the outside interest and the main interest go wonderfully together in some great solution. Bird watching made him interested in bird evolution, and this interest brought him to New Guinea. And we'll hear quite a lot about New Guinea. Mr. Diamond, by the way, told me that he is now planning and organizing nature reserves in Western New Guinea for the World Wildlife Fund. There in New Guinea, at the beginning of the 70s, he met a local politician named Yali, who asked him a question, and I'll quote the question. Why is it that you white people developed so much cargo? Cargo here stands for all these practical Western goods, and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own. And it's a wonderful, romantic idea, I think, that Guns, Germs and Steel is the actual answer to Jali's question. Well, to some extent it is, but Professor Diamond told me that he would have written a book along these lines eventually, even without visiting New Guinea. So much for the romantic imagination. I was slightly disappointed, but, well, the book is here, so who cares? Guns, Germs and Steel is a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, I would say do read it after this lecture. By clear reasoning, it creates a seemingly self-evident order in the history and interaction of human societies between about 11,000 years ago and about 1500 AD. If you want to know the story of the human animal before 11,000 years ago, from about 7 million years ago to 11,000 years ago, read his first book, which is called The Third Chimpanzee. That's us, of course. The Third Chimpanzee. The central question, or Jali's question, can be rephrased in a dramatic way that leads to one of the most fascinating chapters in the book. Why was it that a Spanish soldier named Pizarro turned up in the middle of the Inca Empire with 168 soldiers and took the Inca emperor, who was surrounded by thousands of his Inca soldiers, as a prisoner? Why was it that the Inca emperor, who was called Atahualpa, didn't turn up in Madrid to take the Spanish king prisoner? That, in a way, the answer to that question leads to the whole book, Guns, Germs and Steel. Of course, I knew the story of Pizarro and Cortés, but I had never asked myself that particular question in that particular way. And reading Germs, and Steel made me feel a little bit jealous. Indeed, why didn't I ever think of that question, let alone the fascinating answers? And with that confession of humility, I'll give the floor to Professor Diamond.
Will you be able to hear me okay in the back of the room? Can you hear up there? Good. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in the Netherlands. My previous two visits here were in 1950 and in 1959. And my 1959 visit ended inauspiciously when, taking a walk at night on a crowded street, I thought it would be less dangerous if I stepped down from the street onto the sidewalk, and what I stepped into was instead a canal. It took me 41 years to overcome now that traumatic reintroduction to the Netherlands. Nevertheless, I feel as if I've been working on the fringe of the Netherlands since 1979, when I began working in what is now Indonesian New Guinea, or Papua, and what for a long time was Dutch New Guinea, and working in Indonesia. My work in New Guinea and Indonesia has meant reading the books and the accounts of Dutch explorers and Dutch ornithologists. I've learned just enough Dutch so that I can make my way through these early accounts. And it's a pleasure to be back here under these circumstances, a pleasure to be here as the guest of the John Adams Institute, and a pleasure to be here at the time when my book, Guns, Germs and Steel, is being released in Dutch by Het Spectrum under the title of, and now listen to my impeccable Dutch accent, Zwaarden, Paarden en Ziektekiemen. Another reason for my pleasure in being here this evening is, of course, that I get to discuss with you the most interesting and important question about human history, namely why human history unfolded differently on different continents. You're going to hear that my answers are geographic answers, and that's another reason for my pleasure in being here. In some countries, people are suspicious about stressing the role of geography in human history. I can't imagine any country where the importance of geography is better understood than in the Netherlands. You look at a map of Europe, and right away you understand the issues in the history of the Netherlands. The specific question that I'll address then is why history unfolded differently for different peoples. For example, as I look out at you this evening, it looks to me as if most, nearly all of you, are of Eurasian origin. Why did history turn out that way? Why was it not the case that Aboriginal Australians or Native Americans came to Europe, killed, infected, exterminated most of the original Dutch, and drove the last surviving Dutch to live on small, undesirable islands off in the Ostsee? It didn't happen that way. When I lecture in Los Angeles, again, most of my audience consists of people of Eurasian origin, yet 500 years ago in Los Angeles, everybody there would have been of Native American origin. Why did history happen that way rather than the reverse way? This is the biggest, broadest question of history. It's a question that professional historians tend to ignore. And I think part of the reason is that the answer to this question now proves to come from fields of knowledge remote from history. The answer depends upon technical details of genetics, molecular biology, linguistics, archaeology, plant biochemistry, animal behavior, epidemiology, discoveries of the last 10 or 20 years. The subtitle of the British edition of my book, I think, well summarizes what it's about. The subtitle seemed too humorous for my American editor, and I noticed that the subtitle has also not been adopted for the Dutch edition, but it does well summarize the book. The British subtitle is A Short History of Everybody for the Last 13,000 Years. So the text of the book is 420 pages long. You can easily calculate 420 pages, 5 continents, 13,000 years, 130 centuries. That means that on the average, I can devote 2/3 of a page of my book to the history of one continent for 1 century. And it makes it clear that I had to omit some details about human history in order to fit it all into 420 pages. This evening, I will try to summarize it all for you in 45 minutes. And therefore, I will have to omit even more details. Nevertheless, I hope this evening to hit the most important things about what happened in history and to provide explanations for them. As background at the beginning, just to remind you that I'll be talking about apparently abstract things like human societies, competition, and history, but what we're really talking about is the fates of individual people like you and me. I'm going to begin by scrolling through slides, portraits of people from different parts of the world, just so you can remind yourself that we're talking about the fates of real people. I'm not going to comment on these portraits. I will just go through them one after another, just to remind you of real people. So could we have the, thank you. Could we have the lights down on the first? A convenient starting point for our discussion is to recognize the differences among different parts of the world in their homogeneity or heterogeneity of human populations. There are some parts of the world where lots of very different people live together within a short distance, and there are other parts of the world where everybody is very similar over large distances. Areas that are particularly heterogeneous include the Indian subcontinent, with 1,000 different languages and very different looking people, genetic diversity. My beloved New Guinea, with again 1,000 languages, enormous genetic and cultural diversity. Aboriginal Australia, with again 260 different languages, people very different in their appearance, and sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps the most diverse continent of all. These heterogeneous parts of the globe contrast with homogeneous areas. For example, tropical Southeast Asia, from the Malay Peninsula through the Philippines, Indonesia, out to Polynesia. Everybody looks similar to each other, like this Polynesian woman, and all their languages are closely related to each other, and all the people are genetically similar over this distance of nearly 12,000 kilometers. Or Europe, while some people in Europe are blue-eyed blondes, for example here, and others are dark-eyed and black-haired, as in Italy. Apart from that, there really is very little difference among Europeans. Genetically, most Europeans speak closely related languages. Europeans are rather similar culturally. Europe is homogeneous. Again, Native Americans, all Indians of both North America and South America, very similar to each other in their genetics and physical appearance. We can now have the lights on again and the slides off for a while. And what can be called black subequatorial Africa. All peoples of Africa, if you take away the Khoisan people and the Pygmies, the black Bantu-speaking African farmers are very similar to each other. Thank you. We could have the lights full up now. Okay. Why these differences? Why are some areas heterogeneous and others homogeneous? Is it just a matter of time? Is it that the parts of the globe where humans arrived most recently, there just hasn't been time to evolve much genetic and linguistic diversity? That time factor could explain why the peoples of the New World are so homogeneous. The New World was the last continents to be colonized by people, probably only about 13,000 years ago. So there just hasn't been time to evolve much genetic or physical diversity among North American and South American Indians. But the time factor certainly doesn't explain some of these other examples that I've been giving you. For example, the famous fossils of Java man, or maybe she actually was Java woman. Whether Java man or Java woman show us that people have been on the tropical island of Java in Indonesia for at least 1 million, maybe nearly 2 million years. Why, after all that time, is everybody from the Malay Peninsula out to Easter Island over those 12,000 kilometers so similar? There's been plenty of time to evolve genetic diversity. Or Europe, again, the famous fossil of Heidelberg man, or maybe she was Heidelberg woman, tell us that people have been in Europe for at least 600,000 years, maybe longer. Why, after all that time, are Europeans still so similar to each other in their genes and their languages? Or Africa, the cradle of humanity. Africa is the continent where people have been for the longest time. People evolved in Africa beginning about 5 million years ago. Why, after all this time, are all the black farmers of subequatorial Africa so similar to each other in appearance and in language? By contrast, New Guinea and Australia have been occupied for only about 60,000 years, and yet there's tremendous genetic diversity in New Guinea and Australia, far greater than after 600,000 years in Europe or after 1.5 million years in tropical Southeast Asia or after 5 million years in Africa. Either something must have happened to promote rapid genetic diversification of the peoples of Australia and New Guinea, or else something happened recently to homogenize the peoples of Europe and of tropical Southeast Asia and of black subequatorial Africa. It turns out that the correct explanation is the latter explanation. The populations of Europe and tropical Southeast Asia and black subequatorial Africa were homogenized recently within the last 10,000 years by the so-called agricultural expansions. And there just hasn't been enough time since that recent restirring of the pot to re-evolve much diversity in Europe or Southeast Asia or Africa. What do I mean by the agricultural expansions? 12,000 years ago, 13,000 years ago, everybody everywhere in the world was a hunter-gatherer, gaining their living by hunting animals, wild animals, and gathering wild foods. Hunter-gatherer societies are mostly nomadic. They move around, changing base every few days or every few weeks to follow the seasonally shifting food supply. And hunter-gatherers live at low population densities, 1 person per square kilometer or much less. Gatherers are at low densities, partly because most of the plants and animals out there are not edible to us humans, so there's just not much food there for a hunter-gatherer. But also because if you're a hunter-gatherer woman and you're going to be moving camp every few weeks, you can't afford to have 2 babies within a 4-year span. You can't move camp until your second youngest child can walk fast enough to keep up with a group. And so hunter-gatherer women space out their children at intervals of 4 years. Only when the previous child has reached the age of 4 years and can keep up with a group can a hunter-gatherer woman have another child. So that's why hunter-gatherers have low population densities. Hunter-gatherers don't produce much in the way of storable food surpluses. They hunt and they gather their food each day. And because they don't have stored food surpluses, they don't have food. Every adult in a hunter-gatherer society spends part of every day going out and hunting or gathering food. That means that there are not food surpluses that can be used to feed people who won't procure their own food, but will sit home spending all their time figuring out how to smelt iron or make pottery or design writing systems or atomic bombs. In addition, if you're going to move camp every 3 weeks, the last thing you want is a printing press or a whole collection of pots or an atomic bomb to carry with you. So there we have 2 reasons why the technology of hunter-gatherers has always been simple, why no hunter-gatherer society ever developed metal tools. In addition, the fact that hunter-gatherers don't have storable food surpluses meant that, again, that hunter-gatherer societies were egalitarian. Everybody, every adult was out there gathering food, so there were no full-time chiefs or kings or priests or bureaucrats or these other parasites upon society who eat the food gathered by other people and then sit home and say, I'm your boss and I'll eat your food. All of those things about hunter-gatherer societies changed with the advent of agriculture about 10,000 years ago. Agriculture, for the first time in human history, permitted lots of people to live, settle down in permanent villages next to their permanent gardens and orchards and pastures. The adoption of agriculture resulted in a population explosion. Out there in that wheat field or in that pasture, all of the plants and all of the animals are edible to us humans. Much higher density of food, so the population densities of farmers are 100, 1,000 people per square kilometer, as you know very well in Holland. And in addition, farmers, because they're living settled in a village, they don't have this problem of carrying the babies with them when they shift camp. And so a farmer woman can afford to have babies more often than every 4 years. The birth spacing among traditional farmer societies drops from the 4 years of hunter-gatherers to about 2 years. There are 2 reasons then for the enormous population explosion associated with farming. In addition, with farming, a modest number of farmers, peasant farmers, can produce enough food that can be stored to feed people who don't have to spend any time producing food for themselves. And so those stored food supplies can be used to feed people who will spend all their time sitting there figuring out how to smelt iron and how to make pottery and how to devise writing systems and ultimately how to build guns. In addition, that stored food is a temptation. It's a temptation for some particularly enterprising farmer to say, hi folks, I'm going to be your new boss, your chief, your king, your priest. I'm not going to go out there raising food like you peasants, and then instead that stored food will serve me and my bureaucrats and my tax collectors and my priests. And in return for that, I'm going to render you folks services. We're going to organize this community. I'm going to govern you. And among other things, we're going to organize an army, and we're going to go kill the people next door And in addition, if you folks revolt, that army is there to kill you guys too. So the development of farming meant the appearance of socially stratified societies with technological specialists and with centralized political power. We now have a whole series of reasons why farmers can kill or drive out hunter-gatherers in any area suitable for farming. First of all, the farmers are at much higher population densities, 100 or 1,000 farmers for every hunter-gatherer. Secondly, the farmers have much more advanced technology. Initially, copper swords, and then bronze swords, and steel swords, and guns, and finally atomic bombs. And the farmers also have a centralized political organization with a chief or a king who can go organize the attack, and a priest who can say, I absolve you and those heathens, it's okay to go kill those heathens next door, and in fact it's good to do it. Those are the reasons then why human history for the last 13,000 years has consisted of a succession of farmers driving out, killing, infecting hunter-gatherers over all parts of the world suitable for farming. We've seen it in modern times since the year 1492. We've seen it as European farmers have exterminated or conquered the native hunter-gatherers of Australia and of the western North America and the sand hunter-gatherers of southern Africa and the native Siberians. But these conquests of hunter-gatherers by farmers began much earlier in human history. Since farming provided so much power for the first farmers, it's initially surprising why didn't hunter-gatherers in any part of the world go out and domesticate some of the plants and animals around them and become farmers and thereby gain an advantage over neighboring people. For example, why didn't some Aboriginal Australians go out and domesticate kangaroos and start growing eucalyptus trees and become farmers and conquer other hunter-gatherer Aboriginal Australians? This question becomes especially paradoxical when you think of the areas of the modern world that are the most productive areas for agriculture today. None of the areas of productive agriculture in the world today were areas where agriculture developed independently. And that especially should interest you people from the Netherlands, because I believe that the most intensive productive agriculture in the world today is in the Netherlands and some other parts of Europe, and yet agriculture never arose spontaneously in the Netherlands. It was brought in from the outside. Obviously, the Netherlands is ideal land for agriculture. Why didn't the original inhabitants of the Netherlands develop agriculture for themselves? In the United States, the centers of agriculture are California, where I live, and the Great Plains. Again, no independent origins of agriculture. No independent origins of agriculture in Java, one of the most densely populated farming societies in the Indian subcontinent, teeming with peasant farmers today. In the Cape of South Africa, in the wheat belt of Australia, all these centers of modern farming had no independent origins of agriculture. They acquired it from elsewhere. The reason for this paradox is that the agricultural lifestyle, as it developed, had to compete with the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And the first farmers could outcompete the hunter-gatherers only if the first farmers had a whole package of productive crops and animals to encourage them to settle down and become farmers. But it turns out that only a tiny fraction of the wild plants and animal species around the world are suitable for domestication. And very few areas of the world, at most 9 areas, maybe as few as 5 areas of the world, had enough wild plant and animal species suitable for domestication for farming to start there independently. This paradox is clearest when you look at domestic mammals. There are 4,000 species of mammals around, wild mammals around the world. Every continent, even Australia, has hundreds of wild mammals. So why didn't the people of every continent go out and domesticate mammals and become herdsmen? Why didn't Aboriginal Australians domesticate kangaroos and koala bears? Of the 14 most important large domestic mammal species of the world today, 13 of them are derived from European or Asian wild ancestors. Those 13 valuable wild mammals derived from Eurasia are the cow, sheep, goat, pig, horse, the reindeer, the donkey, the Arabian camel, the Bactrian camel, the yak, the water buffalo, the gaur, the bantang. There's only one large mammal, one large wild mammal that was domesticated in the New World. Can anyone think of that one big mammal domesticated in the New World? Llama. Somebody's read my book. That's correct. The llama, the only wild mammal, the llama and alpaca, breeds of the same animal, the only large wild mammal domesticated in the New World. What was the matter with all those other big mammals of the New World? It turns out that for a wild mammal to be domesticated, it has to possess at least 6 different characteristics. And the vast majority of wild mammal species are derailed by lacking one or another of those characteristics. For example, you obviously cannot domesticate and grow an animal whose food, whose diet you cannot supply. But koalas of Australia are finicky eaters that eat only the leaves of certain eucalyptus trees. So it's hard for even your enterprising Dutch farmers or Aboriginal Australians to go feed koalas. Again, no farmer, not even your very patient Dutch farmers, are going to have the patience to grow a barnyard animal that grows very slowly and isn't ready for the slaughterhouse until 20 years. And so your patient Dutch farmers have chosen not to grow gorillas, which otherwise would be a fabulous food production animal. What Dutch farmer will wait 20 years until his or her barnyard gorilla is ready to kill and send to the slaughterhouse? You would rather have an animal that's ready to send off in a year or two. Again, farmers are not going to domesticate animals which, when they're old enough to go to the slaughterhouse, are more likely to slaughter you than you to slaughter it. And so I recognize that your Dutch farmers are strong and courageous, but nevertheless they never domesticated your brown bear, which would be a fabulous food production animal because brown bears will eat almost any garbage and they grow to full size in a few years, but they have a nasty disposition. You can't domesticate an animal that refuses to breed in captivity. Cheetahs, which would have been great hunting animals, vicuña of the Andes, which would have had the world's best wool, they won't breed in captivity and couldn't be domesticated. Animals which don't have a follow-the-leader social structure, animals which when you pen them in, panic and jump over the fence or bash over the fence, again can't be domesticated. The result is that only about 14 species of big mammals were domesticated around the world, and 13 of them happened to be Eurasian, 1 from America, none from sub-Saharan Africa or Australia. Surprisingly, then one consequence of this is that the acute crowd infectious diseases of humans, the diseases by which European people killed most Native Americans, infected and killed most Native Americans and Aboriginal Australians, diseases like smallpox and measles and mumps and flu and pertussis, these diseases now confined to humans evolved from diseases of our domestic animals. Flu evolved from a disease of pigs, measles evolved from a disease of cattle, tuberculosis from a disease of cattle, pertussis from a disease of pigs, but the most domestic mammals were in Eurasia. So Eurasians evolved these nasty germs to which they themselves became partly immune, and they then transmitted these nasty germs to Aboriginal Australians, Native Americans who had no immunity and died in huge numbers. Surprisingly, it's also the case for plants as well. This initially really comes as a surprise. There are 200,000 species of higher plants in the world. Every continent, even Australia, has tens of thousands of wild plant species. So why didn't people anywhere, even Aboriginal Australians, go out and domesticate some wild plants and become farmers? Again, most wild plants, for various reasons, cannot be domesticated. And those that can are distributed very unevenly around the globe. For example, consider the large-seeded grasses, cereals that provide more than half of the calories of people today, the cereals that include wheat and barley and rice and corn. Around the world, there are only 56 wild species of large-seeded cereals, and of those 56 species, 32 were confined to the Mediterranean zone of Western Asia and Eastern Europe. So, of course, the people of that Mediterranean zone had a huge head start on farming. In their territory grew the ancestors of emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley, and the hybrid partner of bread wheat. In fact, the first agriculture and herding arose around 8500 BC in the part of the world known today as the Fertile Crescent, that crescent-shaped band of land extending through parts of what today are Iran, Iraq, Syria, southeastern Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. That area happened to be the place where there grew the wild ancestors of wheats and barley, peas, lentils, flax, chickpeas, cow, sheep, goat, pig, and nearby horse. So within a short time, hunter-gatherers of the Fertile Crescent assembled the most valuable package of crops and animals that the world has ever seen. And around the same time, or soon thereafter, hunter-gatherers in China domesticated millets and rice and chickens and pigs and water buffalo and became farmers. Later, farming arose independently in the highlands of New Guinea and in Ethiopia and Africa's Sahel zone and tropical West Africa, and in the New World in the southeastern United States, Mexico, and the Andes. But those 9 places that I've named are the only even possible places for the independent origins of agriculture. Agriculture spread everywhere else in the world from those 9 homelands, and in particular, agriculture never rose independently in Europe, California, Australia, South Africa, etc. As for the spread of agriculture, in some cases, agriculture and herding spread as a result of the crops and animals themselves spreading and being adopted by hunter-gatherers who settled down and became farmers. That happened, for example, in southern Africa, where the original Khoisan people of southern Africa, the so-called Hottentots and Bushmen, acquired cattle and sheep and goats from the north and became herders themselves. Usually, though, the hunter-gatherers never had a chance to become farmers or herders. What instead happened was that the farmers and herders from these 9 homelands spread out themselves, carrying their crops and animals with them, overrunning, killing, exterminating, infecting the hunter-gatherers. And so farming and herding usually spread as a result of the spread of the farmers and herders themselves. My last slide, please. This last slide will illustrate an interesting way in which crops and animals spread around the world. Look at this map of the world. This is completely familiar to you. There's one thing on this map that I never thought of until I got to work on my book, Zwaarden, Paarden en Ziektekiemen. And that is, look at the shapes of the continents. The Eurasian continent, long from west to east, narrow from north to south. That's to say, the major axis of Eurasia is east-west. The Americas, long from north to south, narrow from east to west. Major axis of the Americas, north-south. Africa, similarly, major axis, north-south. Okay, this is cute, pretty. Does it mean anything for human history? Yes, it meant a huge amount. It meant that plants and animals domesticated in any part of Eurasia could spread for thousands of miles, always remaining at the same latitude, encountering the same seasonality, day length, climates, diseases, and habitats. And so when crops and animals were domesticated in one part of Eurasia, they often spread rather rapidly to other parts, enriching the agriculture of those other parts. For example, when wheat was domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, wheat spread to Greece in 7000 BC. And a mere 1,500 years later, the hunter people in Holland had adopted wheat and barley and cows and sheep and had settled down to become farmers and herders using those Fertile Crescent crops and animals. And the horses domesticated in the Ukraine, within a couple of thousand years, they had spread to France and Holland, and they had spread east all the way to China and Japan, enriching the economies of these other parts. In contrast, in the New World and Africa, with that north-south axis, crops and animals could not spread far without encountering climates and day lengths to which they were not adapted. And as a result, the llama, the llama domesticated in the Andes never spread the mere 1,500 kilometers to Mexico. The turkey, domesticated in Mexico, never spread to the Andes. Mexican Indians invented the wheel. Andean Indians domesticated the llama. But the wheel never spread to the Andes and the llama never spread to Mexico. So there was never any wheel transport in the New World. The wheel never met the draft animal because of that north-south axis. In modern times, the ingredients of success for farmers over hunter-gatherers can be summarized in that metaphorical title of my book, Zwaarden, Paarden en Ziektekiemen. Those are metaphors for the advantages of farmers over hunter-gatherers. But ancient farmers possessed advantages too. And the result has been a massive population replacement over the last 10,000 years of farmers replacing hunter-gatherers. That's what homogenized the population of Europe and of tropical Southeast Asia and of black subequatorial Africa. As a result, 90% of the people in the world today speak languages of language families that 10,000 years ago were confined to two tiny areas, either the Fertile Crescent or China. If you could have looked at a linguistic map of the world 10,000 years ago, here are these two small areas, Fertile Crescent and China. All the languages spoken anywhere else have either disappeared or are today spoken only by 10% of the world's population. And everybody else speaks languages derived from the Fertile Crescent or China. For example, the Dutch language and the English language and the German language, as well as Italian and Russian. Those are all languages of the Indo-European language family, which arose either in or somewhere near the Fertile Crescent and spread over Europe, east to India, not because the languages were especially beautiful, which I can't claim for English, but because those were the languages of the first farmers who replaced the hunter-gatherers of Europe and India. Among the replacements of hunter-gatherers by farmers in ancient times, we've seen in the last 500 years European farmers replace the hunter-gatherers of the American West and Aboriginal Australia. There were similar replacements in ancient times that archaeologists have studied. The clearest cases are cases in which the immigrant farmers and the indigenous hunter-gatherers were very unlike each other, so you can recognize the differences. One example is the so-called Austronesian expansion. Farmers from the coast of South China began to expand 4000 BC, 6,000 years ago, into Taiwan, then the Philippines, then Indonesia, Malay Peninsula, out into the Pacific to Polynesia. And that's why everybody in that vast area today speaks Austronesian languages and looks very similar, because the clock was reset by that Chinese farmer expansion of 4000 BC. Those Chinese farmers, if you could have come to Indonesia 6,000 years ago, the people of Indonesia would have looked like modern New Guineans or Aboriginal Australians, but they were largely replaced by Chinese farmers. Or again, in subequatorial Africa, the reason why after 7 million years all the black farmers of subequatorial Africa look the same and speak similar languages, Bantu languages, is that beginning around 3000 BC, black farmers with crops domesticated in West Africa began to expand east, reaching Kenya and Tanzania around 2,000 years ago, and then in 1 or 2 centuries spread all the way from the equator south to South Africa. And that rapid recent expansion replaced over all of subequatorial Africa the original hunter-gatherers, except in the 2 areas where black farming would not work, in the Congo rainforest and in the Mediterranean zone and deserts of southern Africa. That's the reason why all the black farmers of southern Africa look similar, because they shared a common ancestor 2,000 years ago. Well, usually when one thinks about this subject of why some people conquered other people, often one falls back on racist explanations. When I ask people in the United States, why do you think that Europeans conquered Aboriginal Australians or Native Americans? Here's the answer that I get, and within the past few months, I've gotten this answer from cabinet ministers and from leaders of American industry and from American university professors. It's not just ignorant people who say this, but the most educated people. They'll say, well, I know this isn't politically correct. I don't like to say this, but let's face it, let's say it. It's because Europeans were smarter than all those other people, and they had the work ethic and the Judeo-Christian tradition. And people will say this, although there's not the slightest bit of evidence for Europeans and Asians having any genetic superiority in intelligence over other people. The reason that people fall back on these racist explanations of history's biggest pattern is that historians have not told us what the correct explanation is. And so, of course, people fall back on the most transparent interpretation. People look different in their skins and hair color, so we assume that perhaps they're also different inside their brains, and maybe that's why Europeans conquered these other people. In fact, it's clear that the European conquest was nothing more than the culmination of historical processes. That took 13,000 years. Just consider the shape of the world, the state of the world in the year AD 1492, when Columbus sailed to the New World. At that time, and the Americas were occupied by people with stone or wooden tools, and Aboriginal Australians were hunter-gatherers and tribal organizations. Of course, the empires with the steel tools and nasty germs and horses exterminated or drove out the tribes with the stone and wooden tools. So why is it that in 1492, Australia and the New World had stone and wooden tools and Eurasia had steel tools? That's the result of developments since 11,000 BC, not because of any biological differences among the peoples themselves. It's because of effects of the environment, namely that the Eurasian continent had far more domesticable wild plant and animal species, that east-west axis, and it's a bigger continent and it's less isolated. Often I still hear the objection, well, that's nice speculation, but I want an experiment to prove it. Is there any experiment if the Aboriginal Australians could have been brought to Europe 13,000 years ago? Can you prove to me they would have gone out and conquered the world, not the Europeans? History did not give us that experiment. History gave us an experiment close to it. If you want to think that Europeans are superior, history did the following experiment. 1,000 years ago, there were Germanic people living in Scandinavia and Holland and England, and some of those Germanic people stayed home in Holland and Scandinavia, and others of them emigrated to with their iron tools and their advanced societies. And in Greenland, they encountered the Inuit, the Eskimos, with their stone tools and tribal organization. And 500 years later, who do you think had won that competition between the Europeans and the Inuit? 500 years later, the Europeans were extinct in Greenland. Greenland was once again firmly in the hands of the stone tool using Inuit, and yet the relatives of those Germanic peoples who emigrated to Greenland and failed there, their relatives were staying home in Holland and England and developing the world's great art traditions and the world's great literature and the world's great mercantile traditions, all a matter of different. Well, these are big questions at the interface between history and biology, linguistics, genetics. I promised that I'd summarize everything about history for you in 40 minutes, and that unfortunately means that there are many important factors in world history that I haven't had time to discuss in 40 minutes, but that I do discuss in my book, Zwaarden, Paarden, and Ziektekiemen. For example, I've told you today little or nothing about the distribution of domesticable plant species, to which I devote 3 chapters of Zwaarden, Paarden, etc. I haven't told you anything about the precise way in which the development of writing and technology and government and organized religion depended on agriculture and herding. That gets 3 chapters of Zwaarden, Paarden. I haven't discussed with you the fascinating differences within Eurasia between the histories of China, India, the Near East, and Europe. That I wrap up, summarize in 9 pages of Zwaarden, Paarden. I haven't discussed the effects of individuals, the so-called great man theory, and I haven't discussed cultural differences unrelated to the environment on human history, which gets 2 pages of Zwaarden, Paarden. But it's now time to summarize for you the overall meaning of this whirlwind tour through human history with its unequally distributed guns and germs. About 15 years ago, I stopped being just a sober academic writing boring things for other academics and tried to convey something of the excitement of science to a broad public. I quickly encountered an occupational hazard of the academic who would like to address the public. And that occupational hazard is to encounter a television reporter or a newspaper reporter or a radio interviewer who will say to me things like the following: Mr. Diamond, I know that you've devoted the last 5 years of your life to reading hundreds or thousands of books and articles and condensing it all into this 420-page book. But, Mr. Diamond, please remember, our listeners and our viewers and our newspaper readers are busy people. So please, Mr. Diamond, would you summarize everything about history in one sentence? And I've learned how to do it. The broadest pattern of history, namely the differences between human societies on different continents, seems to me to be attributable to differences among continental environments, and not at all to biological differences among peoples themselves. One sentence. But once you've said that one sentence, you can usually slip in another sentence. And so I go on. In particular, Miss Reporter, the availability of wild plant and animal species suitable for domestication and the ease with which those species could spread without encountering unsuitable climates contributed decisively to the varying rates of rise of agriculture and herding, which in turn contributed decisively to the varying rates of rise of human population numbers, population densities, and food surpluses, which in turn contributed decisively to the varying rates of rise of epidemic infectious diseases, writing, technology, and political organization. Now, as a biologist hired by the University of California to practice laboratory experimental science, I know well that many of my scientist colleagues are inclined to dismiss such historical interpretations as unprovable speculation because they are not founded on what scientists consider to be the hallmark of science, namely replicated laboratory experiments carried out by little men wearing white laboratory coats. The same objection can be raised against any of the historical sciences, and those historical sciences include astronomy, evolutionary biology, geology, ecology, and the objection can, of course, be raised against the whole field of the other social sciences. That's the reason why we are uncomfortable about considering history as a science. It's classified as a social science, which is considered not quite scientific. But let's remember that the goal of science is to acquire knowledge. In science, we seek knowledge by whatever methodologies are available and appropriate. There are many fields that nobody hesitates to consider sciences, even though in those fields replicated laboratory experiments would be impossible or illegal or immoral. For example, an astronomer can't understand star evolution by manipulating some stars. Let's turn off Betelgeuse today and turn off Capella and Aldebaran tomorrow, while keeping Sirius and Procyon as unmanipulated controls. And we can't start and stop, geologists cannot start and stop ice ages. If you want to understand why Holland is flat, you can't do the experiment of starting up some new glaciers and watching Holland get flattened and then melting your glaciers. And similarly, paleontologists cannot understand dinosaurs by experimenting with designing a new set of dinosaurs and then exterminating them again. Nevertheless, astronomers and geologists and paleontologists have succeeded in gaining considerable insight into these historical sciences by other means. So we should surely be able to understand human history, because introspection and preserved writings give us far more insight into the ways of past humans than we shall ever have into the ways of past dinosaurs. For that reason, I'm optimistic that we can eventually arrive at convincing explanations for these broadest patterns of human history. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you a few. Hij staat aan? Ja, hij staat aan. Het zou natuurlijk veel handiger zijn als je met zo'n microfoontje werd geboren. Hè? Dat je alleen aan je oor hoeft te trekken en dan begint hij te werken. Maar dat komt misschien nog. I wanted to ask you a few practical questions to begin with, which arose in me after reading your book, and then I'll come to some more general questions, and of course the public is invited to ask its own questions, especially when you have read the book or didn't understand the lecture, whatever the reasons. What fascinated me in the book, what actually amazed me, human history is generally described as a history of the acquisition of new technology. But strangely enough, some people lose technology instead of acquiring technology. They have technologies and then they lose them. For example, the Tasmanians who lived in Tasmania, completely isolated for about 10,000 years, lost the art of fishing, which seemed to me incredibly stupid. I mean, you see them swimming and you suddenly stop catching them. And they are full of good nutrition and so on. I mean, they taste wonderfully. Or perhaps the fishes in Tasmania tasted horrible. That's a possibility. But could you, and of course the Polynesians, when they went further east in the Pacific, also lost some of their very practical technologies. How can you explain that people lose a technology instead of acquiring new technologies under new circumstances?
This is very puzzling and intriguing. Why is it that people lose or give up apparently useful technologies such as fishing or bows and arrows or making pottery or guns? Japan had the most and the best guns in the world in 1650, and then Japan gave up guns. A way to think of it is that there are conflicting forces on any technology. There are forces in opposition to it. There are also what we call in English fads. There are occasional preferences that are prejudices against a particular technology. If the technology is valuable, and if one society gives it up, then neighboring societies that still have the technology will either use their advantage to conquer the society that gave it up, or will be there as a model to readopt it. These societies that gave up technology that you've mentioned, they're isolated societies that had no neighbors to compete with. Japan could give up guns because there was nobody else around there with guns. We see the same thing in Europe. In Europe, there were princes who gave up guns. There were princes who banned cannon. There were principalities where the copyists didn't like printing in Gutenberg's Bible and banned printing. But you can guess what happened. When one prince, in some ways in Europe, banned guns, it took about 1 month before the next prince who had guns to start a war of invasion. And the first prince then either was conquered or was forced to reacquire the guns. So this is something that you see beginning even in Europe, but that can go to completion only in isolated societies. But when you ask the details, what actually happened as the Tasmanians were giving up their fish, I asked
giving
that
up
too.
fishing. And there's of course a great difference between Japan and Tasmania, because Japan was a centralized society and there was a group of people, the samurai, who disliked the guns because their whole tradition of sword fighting or whatever these people did was lost because of the guns. But in Tasmania these were very primitive hunter-gatherers. And it seems to me that you could even catch fish by hand if you're really quick, and that makes it very. It wasn't a political decision as it was in Japan, or the famous decision, of course, of the Chinese emperor who said, "Well, I kind of dislike all this extroverted technology, and let's stop it," which made China, of course, a kind of loser in the last 500 years instead of a big winner. But these Tasmanians, they really amaze me. There was no particular political organization. How did they do it?
There were some ethnographically witnessed cases in non-politically centralized societies. For example, on islands of the Pacific, the only large meat production animal is the pig. And pigs nevertheless get into your gardens and mess up your gardens, and pigs are a status symbol and they're a cult symbol, so there's a lot of stuff going on with pigs. And the vast majority of Polynesians and New Guineans kept their pigs and treasured their pigs, and that's the main source of meat. But there were a few Polynesian islands where the people got an idea, pigs are bad, they're messing up our gardens too much, or they don't fit in with our beliefs, let's kill all the pigs. And then they make a quick decision and they kill all the pigs over the whole island. If it's an island that's near another island, then in a year they say, oh my God, what a mistake we made, and they get the pigs from next door. With the Tasmanians, my guess is there was something like that. There was a spread of a taboo against eating fish, so some people in Europe don't eat fish on Friday, the Tasmanians don't, or what, do eat fish on Friday. Some Tasmanians stopped eating fish 7 days of the week. It seemed superior. Other Tasmanians adopted it. And when they had all given it up, there was nobody anymore who remembered the techniques for fishing. That's the best I can make of it.
Well, you haven't been there, of course, and I haven't been there, but it still amazes me. My second question, when hunter-gatherers invaded the Americas about 13,000 years ago from Siberia, they proceeded to kill almost all big mammals living in the Americas. And you describe that as particularly easy because these mammals were not used to men and didn't know about our killing habits, so they were quite successful in exterminating all these animals. But then my first question is, why wasn't the bison killed by these killers? I mean, elephants were all killed and the bison remained.
That's right. In the Americas, when humans came to the Americas 13,000 years ago, there were a lot of species of big wild mammals, and 85% of them were exterminated, but 15% were not. And the survivors include the wisent or bison, elk, what in Britain they call red deer, moose, what in Britain I think they call elk. So there were some big mammals that survived. Why did these particular big mammals survive? The best sense I can make of it is that the big mammals that survived were ones that had invaded the New World from Eurasia relatively recently. The bison.
So they knew the humans.
They had acquired experience of humans in the Old World and had carried that with them. That's the best guess that I can make.
And why wasn't the bison domesticated?
Why wasn't the bison
I
domesticated?
mean, they look quite friendly. And rather stupid, by the way. And they are social animals.
Walk up to one and see. The North American bison was not domesticated. The European bison was also not domesticated. European farmers who had domestic cows, sheep, and goats, and pigs did not domesticate the bison. That suggests there's something wrong with bison for domestication. My guess is it's the social structure, that bison do not have a follow-the-leader social structure. Sheep do have a follow-the-leader social structure, and so you get this little 30-kilogram shepherd girl or shepherd boy followed by a line of 170-kilogram sheep, because the sheep have a follow-the-leader social structure, and the sheep they're very stupid, and they've come to believe that this little boy or little girl in front is the alpha sheep, so they'll follow the sheep. Seriously, that's the social structure of the herd animals that we have domesticated. But I think bison lack that structure. And so you cannot get bison.
Did they ever try to domesticate the bison?
In North America, for the past several decades, people have ranched bison. That's to say, they built fences and the bison in the middle of the fence. But people have not tamed bison so that you lead them on a stick. They're still nasty animals.
I see, yeah. This next question is a kind of follow-up question to this one, because you, of course, write in the book that most African big animals were used to men. They knew that man was a dangerous killer, and that's why they weren't killed off, all of them. And you also write that most of them couldn't be domesticated, which was a great problem. But now I read in the Dutch newspapers that we have some highly profitable ostrich farms in the Netherlands. Now, why didn't these Bantu herders try to domesticate the ostrich? Another extremely stupid animal with a lot of meat and a very small head.
That's a very current question because my two friends and I this evening ate in a restaurant, and what do you think all three of us had for dinner?
Ostrich.
Why weren't they're great. They taste absolutely fabulous. Why were they not domesticated in the past? A possibility is that ostriches are big, strong animals, and today, when you have barnyard ostriches, you keep them in areas with steel fences. You don't keep them in areas with wooden fences. It may be that it just was not technically possible to fence in ostriches before the development of modern steel technology.
What I read about the Dutch ostriches is that they are quite friendly, actually. But
let's visit an ostrich farm and then discuss this question.
In the vicinity of an ostrich. And I have another question which is kind of follow the same kind of line. I can understand that these African animals were knowledgeable about the human animal and the enormous dangers that the human animal brought with it, but still, I mean, we are intelligent. Humans are intelligent. They had weapons, and they could hunt in larger social structures. Why is it that all these animals in these African steppes remained alive and are still there today to view for us as tourists? I mean, we could have killed them if we really wanted to. Why didn't we?
Why did all these African animals remain alive? Has any of you here shot a lion? Okay. You haven't. Shooting a lion with a gun.
Not politically correct anymore.
Okay. I know that all of you have shot lions but won't admit it. Shooting a lion with a gun requires a lot of courage. Killing a lion with a spear requires more courage. As for elephants, killing an elephant with an elephant gun requires courage. Killing an elephant the way Africans do by taking a spear and smearing yourself with elephant dung and creeping up to the elephant so the elephant doesn't see you until you're underneath the elephant, and then raising the spear until with a quick jab you pierce the urinary bladder of the elephant, and then you run away and you wait for the elephant to die. That's why we did not exterminate elephants.
That sounds convincing, but now think of these rather primitive hunter-gatherers who invaded the Americas from Siberia. Yeah. And they succeeded in quite a short time in exterminating all these big animals, some of them elephants. And were they so friendly to the people that they just walked up to them and said, please kill me, I have no evolutionary future whatsoever, so...
I think yes. I've just come back from the Galapagos Islands off Ecuador. I had read about it, but it's still an eye-opener. There, people have written about it, but I saw it with my own eye. The animals there are so tame that they're hopping up to our shoes. They're carrying out their mating and their nesting, ignoring us there. There are accounts when the Russian explorer Bering discovered Bering Strait. He came back and landed on an island called Commodore Island, where there was the world's biggest dugong, or manatee, called Stella's sea cow. It was an animal that was about 10 meters long and it weighed many metric tons. This is an animal that would be capable of defending itself. The way that Bering's men hunted Stella's sea cow was they would paddle a boat up to it and jab a hook into the animal. The animal would lie there making piteous sounds but not resisting, and then they would drag the animal to the beach. And the result was that Stella's sea cow was exterminated in 17 years. I do think, on that basis, I expect that in the New World, that people came up to elephants, that elephants did not recognize that people were in danger, that people were jabbing them and the elephants were not defending themselves.
And there was no learning process because, of course, they didn't do that in 25 years. It took them, let's say, a few thousand years. And these elephants in the New World never thought after a few generations, wow, these little guys, you shouldn't trust them at all. They come up to you and have all this wonderful talk, but don't trust them.
There was no learning process because it didn't take a few thousand years. The best evidence we have suggests that it took less than 100 years. In the places where we have the best radiocarbon data, In Arizona and New Mexico, we have lots of very good dates for people, the first people, and we have lots of very good dates for a mountain goat and for a ground sloth, giant ground sloth. It's a big animal, about 7 meters tall. And within about 100 years of the arrival of the first people, the ground sloths and the mountain goat are extinct. And when you do the numbers, how many of them you have to kill, if this is an animal that has a baby only 3 or 4 years anyway, I wouldn't be surprised if they were all extinct within 10 years. So there was just no time to learn. That's also how modern seal hunters exterminated seals on subantarctic islands. The seals too had no chance to learn.
Okay. I'm trying to imagine what happened in these on these Great Plains 13,000 years ago, and 10 years seems to me very, very quickly. Are there any practical questions in the audience? Yeah? Could you stand up, please, and use the mic?
I was wondering if your historical theory then has to do with the future, and in particular in terms of genetic diversity, in terms of diseases, coming plagues, things like that.
You mean that the next 13,000 years?
No, the next
from
100.
The next 100, okay. Could not be possible.
Questions about the future and genetic diversity and diseases. You must have been listening in on conversations about my next book. My next book is about what we can learn from the past about the future. The big question for the future is whether we will succeed in mastering the environmental problems that now threaten us today. And in the Netherlands, I don't have to tell you about these problems, which consist of very high densities of people, a growing population, problems with your water supply, loss of your fisheries from overfishing, problems of pollution of the atmosphere and pollution of the water, loss of forest products. At the rate at which we're going now, either society will master these problems in the next 50 years, or we will fail to master them and our civilization will collapse. So that's the real question for the next 50 years.
What are the percentages in your view? I mean, I will be dead in 50 years, so it's not my particular personal problem, but you're thinking of your children and your grandchildren.
The chances that your children will have a world like the world we have now to live out their lives in is somewhere between 10% and 90%. What I mean is, and by that I mean that it is literally up for grabs, that if we don't take corrective measures, your children will not have a civilized future. And if we do take corrective measures, then our children can have a civilized future. So it's our choice, and that's why I'm writing my next book, because my children are 13 years old. I have an investment in the future, and I want to motivate people to do the right things rather than the wrong things. This country is a very good country to talk about these things because my understanding is that the level of environmental awareness and involvement in environmental organizations is higher in the Netherlands than in any other country in the world.
That's because we are an ecological disaster area. we have to. But could you elaborate a little bit more on your next book, which in a way is a third volume in a series, and gives a kind of outline of what it's going to be?
Sure.
What the storyline is going to be.
The next book is the third volume in the series. My first book, The Third Chimpanzee, was about everything from 7 million years ago until 13,000 years ago. Worden and Paarden was about everything from 13,000 years ago until the present. And the next book, for which I don't yet have a working title, will be to look at past societies that did destroy their resource base and did collapse, and to extract the lessons for the next 50 years. The cases of the societies that did collapse include Mycenaean Greece, Fertile Crescent societies, the Maya of the Yucatan, Easter Islanders, Angkor Wat, Harappan, Indus Valley civilization. So there were lots of societies that destroyed themselves in the past, even though they had far fewer people than we did today, and they had far less potent destructive technology. From this, I hope to extract the lesson, what makes some societies vulnerable and others less vulnerable, and then to apply these lessons to today. How does our situation today differ from our situation in the past? In some respects, we're more vulnerable today. In some respects, we're less vulnerable. And what can we do to convince everybody else to make the right decisions?
But for example, you write somewhere that Western Europe has a rather robust ecosystem. If you compare it to the Fertile Crescent, where of course they degraded their environment, and when you travel there today you will see that it's largely unusable for any form of intensive agriculture.
That's the good news. The good news is that Western Europe has a robust ecosystem. The bad news is that the average European and the average American and the average Japanese is consuming about 32 times more resources and is putting out about 32 times more sewage than people in the third world. And this is simply not sustainable. Already at present, the Netherlands is dependent on imports. If the rest of the world collapsed, your society would not go on as it is at present.
We could feed ourselves for some time, as far as I know.
Right. Where would your fish and timber and steel and oil come from?
Yeah, that's a problem, but if we sit here long enough, I'll invent a solution for you. Yeah, that's true, of course. We are completely dependent. That's true. Yeah. Another question?
I prepared a rather complex question, which I will read because it's for me myself. It's even too long. Aboriginal Australians and New Guineans have diverged genetically, physically, and linguistically in a period of about 10,000 years after being separated because of the rise in sea level. They diverged because of adaptation to the very different environments and no more gene exchange except for very limited intercourse on the Torres Strait Islands. This is all, of course, from your book. Thus, a period of 10,000 years was sufficient to develop different blood groups and unrelated languages. Now, suppose some psychologist would make a culture fair test for orderliness, neatness, being a sloppy person or not. For instance, by measuring the neatness of the interior or the exterior of someone's hut or hairdo, the way the face or body is painted. And suppose that test would be applied to large groups of New Guineans and Aboriginal Australians living today. And suppose the New Guineans would on average score much higher on that test than the Aboriginal Australians, say 1 standard deviation. If so, what explanation would you prefer for this result? Could this behavioral difference also have been caused by adaptations to the different environments these people lived in for so many generations? If so, by what mechanism? Natural selection or sexual selection? Could an untidy person be more in danger on the coasts of New Guinea than on the plains of Australia? In that case, neatness could help survival and procreation in one environment, but make no difference in the other, thus natural selection. What case could we make for sexual selection? In your fascinating book, The Third Chimpanzee, you've explained why you favor Darwin's theory of sexual selection for the development of differences between the human races in visible physical traits like skin color, the form of breasts, the size and angle of penises, etc. You also showed in that book that married couples resemble each other more in personality traits than in most physical traits, about 0.4 against 0.2, generally speaking. One of the personality traits you mention in particular there is to be a slob or not a slob. You said slobs tend to marry slobs. For those who do not know what a slob is, it's a dirty job living with a slob. Now, the personality trait of being a slob or not, and in what degree, is visible on the outside. in the way we dress or make our hair and face, in the way we keep our belongings and the environment we live in. The trait can be inferred from how we keep our huts built or keep the way we fold our fishnets, for instance. Now, given this result of considerable racial differences in tested slop behavior between New Guineans and Aboriginal Australians, would you think it possible that sexual selection over 10,000 years caused this effect? Or would you rather go for natural selection?
Sure. You've raised many points there. Perhaps the one that I would like to focus on has to do with neatness itself. Does neatness have a genetic component? Maybe, but my wife and I have two 13-year-old children, and my wife and I are both neat, and my wife's mother was extremely neat, and my mother was also neat. My children are SLOBs, slobs, and I observed that within one generation there has been a drastic change in neatness.
No, that's what's going to change in the next few years. And when they marry and have their own children, they suddenly turn into the same neat persons that their father and mother are.
Correct. In that case, let's come back and discuss that question 20 years from now when my kids are happily married.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm right there.
There's a question on that.
Yeah? No, not really. Could you come up to the mic?
Yeah, I have a simple question concerning the identity of Yali. Is he the same guy that the Australians arrested and incarcerated between 1950 and 1955 for cargo cult activities on the north coast of New Guinea?
He's probably the son of that guy. My Yali, whom I met in 1972, was the son of a more famous Yali. And I suspect that it was Yali the father who was incarcerated for cargo cult activities.
Okay, because Yali the father was born approximately 1912, and I don't know how old your Yali was in 1972.
My Yali in 1972 would have been, my guess is about 25 years old, so he would have been born in the 1940s.
Thank you.
Did you, by the way, send him the book as an answer to his question?
I don't know if I would love to. I don't know, when I've been back in New Guinea, I've asked, does anyone know whether my Yali is still alive? And I don't know. I would love to send him the book.
Yes, please.
Professor Diamond, I've read your book and I've listened to this lecture, and I keep wondering, what would you think is actually originally yours in this analysis? I guess the synthesis is yours, but what is actually original about the synthesis?
Parts of the analysis are original, parts of the analysis are synthesized from other parts of the literature. For example, in the chapter on domestication of mammals, an original part was the tabulation of mammals weighing more than 100 kilograms on the different continents, that were omnivores or herbivores, calculation of the number of species, and calculation of the fraction of them that were domesticable. Again, in that same chapter, one of the most difficult problems I had to wrestle with was, if a mammal has not been domesticated, is it just because people didn't try or because the mammal could not be domesticated? And in that chapter I came up with half a dozen different lines of evidence to convince myself that non-domestication of zebras and of other animals had to do with the animals themselves rather than properties of the people. So in short, some of it is synthesis, some of it is new analysis. But often synthesis, bringing things together. Let's not denigrate synthesis, because synthesis, seeing connections between different fields, is something that requires effort.
No, I fully agree with that, but what worries me also, for example, at the end of your lecture, when you gave your summary, well, that summary is almost literally to be found in a book published 20 years ago that you quote in your further reading, C.D. Darlington's The Evolution of Man and Society. And he outlines the basic arguments, also the argument that you have on your slide here, That's exactly to be found in his book. It was also, such a picture is to be found in a book published by British astronomer John Barrow in his book The Artful Universe, published I think 1 or 2 years before your book. And he didn't reference it either, but he must have got it from Darlington, I think. So there must have been a tradition of these ideas, and one of the worrying things is that you don't reference these people, because now it seems as if you have invented all these ideas, while in fact other people did, and you were making use of their ideas.
The ideas are referenced in 40 pages of further readings. It is, of course, people in the past have been attracted to the idea that geography and environment might influence human societies, and they've been working on that idea for a long time. Why is it that they've not succeeded in coming up with a synthetic theory before this? A large part of the reason is that the synthesis depends upon technical information that simply was not available before. For example, the non-domestication of oak trees, one of the most important food plants of Europe. Oak trees were not domesticated because plant biochemists have now found out that bitterness in oak trees is controlled by several genes, whereas in walnuts it's controlled by one gene. That's a detail with huge consequences for human history. So in short, a lot of the information has been gathered only in the last 10 or 20 years. And in addition, the book required bringing together linguistics, genetics, archaeology, etc. And there aren't many people who are sufficiently current with those fields and have friends in all those fields to attempt the synthesis.
One last question. Who wants to ask the last question? Nobody? Then I'm going to ask the last question. You need more time to think up a last question? Okay, I've been thinking, what you have done is to study the broad patterns of human history from an environmental perspective. But how would this work out, this approach to history, to the broad patterns of history, if you look, let's say, at the history of Europe in the last 500 years, instead of over 13,000 years? Is there any way where you think that you could interact this kind of study with the typical historical study in a fruitful way?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think one could pursue it in a fruitful way, but we should be aware of the extremes, that geographical environmental factors are most powerful in explaining things over long time scales and large areas. Short scales and short areas, they are less potent. So whether the stock market went up or down this morning, I'm not going to attribute to Fertile Crescent agriculture of 13,000 years ago, but more likely to things such as the Gore-Bush debate last night, to ephemera of the moment. As for the usefulness of geographical ideas in explaining European history over the last 500 years, there is still considerable utility. And again, in what country is the utility of geographical thinking more obvious than in the Netherlands or Poland, where I came from 2 days ago? Geography still has monumental effects on European history. I would also like to have a little time to chat with some of you individually if you would like to come and chat. So a possibility would be to stop the formal questions and then to give a little time for me to shake hands with any of you who would like to come up.
That's okay. We'll now finish the question and answer session. Mr. Karel Pauwel will finish off the evening with some remarks. Thank you very much.
It's obviously a great pleasure to be allowed a few minutes to react on tonight's proceeding. Contrary to some early remarks, I've gotten an impression of a great author. I read the book twice. Of a great speaker and an entertaining speaker, and certainly also one of humor. In short, I would think there is a new example of at least a Renaissance and a humanist in combining various disciplines and trying exactly for the synthesis, because it is the synthesis that sheds insights into understanding our lives, where we come from and where we're heading. The book for me has 3 messages. The first one, and I'm not trying to be scientific, maybe contrary to popular belief here, but the first one is that it gives me hope. It is an optimistic book. It does do away in a very serious way with racism, and it does make you understand to look at all peoples of this world in a very different and more compassionate way. I think that is a great addition and an enrichment of our intellectual space. The second element is, and it shines through your book, is that you have it's a message of love. Sounds preachy, but the way you describe the new Papua New Guineas, and we obviously have a deep affiliation with Indonesia and those people, it's not just a scientist who observes, but I read through your book an admiration and a love for their skills, their detail, and I just suspect that you admire them in many instances more than you do your Western fellow man, because of their great accomplishment given in their environment. The way you describe how they select seeds, how they can survive in the jungle, is one of admiration, not of a detached scientist. The third observation I have is one of practical applicability. In my former firm, McKinsey & Company, we have a global institute in Washington, and the director of that firm took it upon him 3 years ago to immediately send your book, when it came out, to all senior partners in my firm. It was important for our global consultancy service that we start to understand in a truly global firm, in a global environment, that the differences in race and posture and cultures are ultimately not what matters, and that all the fellow people that we work with are truly coming from the same origin. May it be our Dutch translation on zwaarden, paarden en ziektekiemen, particularly the way you pronounce it, I think is a much better title. It is clear, it's concise, and all nouns are of the same order, of the same category, whereas in your English title, I still have difficulty to remember it. Whereas this one, particularly after you repeating it so often, is very useful. As a last thing, you have condensed everything in 45 minutes. This will lead to, I hope for most of you, to 450 pages, and then still more, many years of reflection. I thank the John Adams Institute. I thank you for your moderation this evening and keeping us in check. I think it was a wonderful evening. Thank you, John Adams Institute, and you too.
Thank you. Will you be seated here? Sure. Professor Diamond will be seated on the podium, and you can ask questions, have your book signed. Thank you.